Okay, so have you ever like been through one of those big shakeups at work, where
Hmm.
everything changes and like you almost feel like the rug's been pulled out from under you?
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been there.
Yeah, like that new software that everyone's supposed to use, but no one knows how it works. Or,
Yeah,
even bigger, like when a whole industry has to adapt to some huge disruption. And
absolutely.
it's just that feeling of, whoa, what just happened?
Yeah, that sense of the ground shifting beneath you.
Exactly. And it's funny because for today's deep dive, we're actually starting with something that seems super simple, like almost the opposite of chaos.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
A Newton's cradle, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, those shiny metal balls.
Yes, exactly. You lift one, it swings back and forth, and the energy just transfers so smoothly.
Click, click, click.
Exactly. It seems so basic, right?
Right.
But what we're going to unpack for you today is how this seemingly simple toy
Okay.
can actually give us some really powerful insights into how change happens. Yeah, and it's all thanks to the work of Dr. Butterfield and his fascinating exploration of the Newton's cradle as a metaphor for understanding organizational change.
And that's where change imagined through Newton.pdf comes in, right?
Yes, exactly. That's our main source for today's deep dive.
Very cool.
So what we're going to do is really break down the differences between those changes that happen in a kind of linear, predictable way
Okay.
versus the ones that are more like, well, like our world right now, disruptive and kind of unpredictable.
Right, more like those unexpected collisions.
Exactly. And by the end of this, we really hope that you'll be able to look at the changes happening around you and be like, okay, I see what kind of cradle this is.
Ah, I love that analogy.
Right. Because knowing which type of change you're dealing with can make all the difference in how you approach it and how you can actually use it to your advantage instead of just feeling overwhelmed.
It's all about making sense of the chaos, right?
Exactly. And Dr. Butterfield does a brilliant job of showing us how to do that.
He really uses the Newton's cradle in such a clever way,
Yeah, in both its traditional form and then some really interesting variations.
which I'm excited to dig into.
Me too. So why don't we start with that classic image of the Newton's cradle? You know, the one you see in all the science
It's a
museums?
perfect setup.
Exactly. So you carefully lift that first ball, let it go, it swings and hits the others, and then that last ball on the opposite end swings out with the same energy.
A beautiful transfer of momentum.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's so clean and predictable.
Right, like a perfectly choreographed dance.
Exactly. And this is precisely what Dr. Butterfield uses to illustrate what he calls linear change in organizations.
And this is where we start to see the magic of the metaphor.
Right.
Right.
Because it's not just about the balls, it's about what they represent.
Exactly. So in this linear model, that initial lifted ball,
Mm-hmm.
that represents the catalyst for change in an organization.
Okay, so the thing that sets everything in motion.
Exactly. It could be a strategic decision by leadership, or a new technology, or even a shift in the market.
Something that creates that initial spark.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And just like in the cradle, that initial energy then needs to travel through the system
Right.
to create the desired outcome on the other side.
Okay, I'm following you.
Now, Dr. Butterfield actually uses a really helpful example of a manufacturing company that's implementing a new inventory management system.
Okay, yeah, let's break that down.
So imagine this company is struggling with inefficiencies, like production delays, overstocking,
Oh, yeah,
understocking.
those classic inventory headaches.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they decide to adopt this new software to streamline everything.
Okay, so that decision to implement the software,
Yeah.
that's like lifting the first ball.
That's it. That's the initial push for change.
Okay, and what happens next?
Well, just like in the cradle, that initial energy encounters some resistance as it moves through the system.
Right, because those middle balls, they don't just jump into action right away.
They don't. And that's exactly what happens in an organization, too. There's this natural inertia.
Right.
People are used to doing things a certain way, and change can feel uncomfortable.
Or even threaten.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In our manufacturing example, this resistance could come from the warehouse team, who are used to the old manual processes.
Right, they might be thinking, why do we need this fancy new software? We've been doing it this way for years.
Exactly. Or they might be worried about learning a whole new system and maybe even making mistakes.
Yeah, that fear of the unknown.
That's very real. And this is where leadership comes in. Just like you need that initial force to lift the first ball in the cradle.
Okay.
Leaders need to actively address that resistance within the organization.
Right, so how do they do that?
It's all about communication and support. They need to clearly explain to the team why this change is necessary,
Okay.
what the benefits will be both for the company and for the employees themselves.
So paint a clear picture of what's in it for them.
Exactly.
Exit.
And then it's about providing the right training and resources to help everyone adapt to the new system.
So they feel empowered and not overwhelmed.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And when you do this effectively, when you address that resistance and provide the right support, that's when you start to see the momentum transfer through the system, just like in the Cradle.
Okay. And what does that look like in our example?
Well, this is when the warehouse team starts to embrace the new software.
Okay.
They're using it consistently and effectively. And the company as a whole starts to see the positive results.
So faster order processing, optimized stock levels, and ultimately happier customers.
That's it. That's the final ball swinging out on the other side of the cradle.
Success.
It's that moment where you can really see the impact of the change.
Right, that tangible outcome.
Exactly. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
Just like even the most perfectly balanced Newton's cradle eventually stops swinging.
Right, it loses momentum.
Organizational change requires ongoing attention and effort to sustain it.
So it's not just a one-time implementation and then you're done.
It's a continuous process.
Okay, so what does that look like in our manufacturing company?
Well, it means constantly monitoring the performance of the new system,
Okay,
addressing any glitches or user issues that come up.
right, those inevitable hiccups.
Exactly. And it's about celebrating the successes along the way to keep the momentum going.
Yeah, reinforce those positive behaviors.
And of course, making sure that new employees are properly trained on the new system.
So it becomes part of the company culture.
Exactly. So that's the key takeaway from the linear model.
Okay.
It's about those changes that are relatively contained, where you have a clear starting point, a well-defined process, and a predictable outcome.
Okay, so you can kind of map it out in advance.
In a way, yes. It's about careful planning, ensuring everyone's on board, and moving forward in a systematic step-by-step manner.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yes.
But as we all know, not all change is that neat and tidy.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where things get really interesting.
Right, because sometimes it feels like there are multiple balls flying at you from all directions.
The frame itself is wobbling.
Exactly. And that's where Dr. Butterfield's modified Newton's Cradle comes in.
Ah, yes. This is where we start to see the real power of the metaphor.
Right, because it's no longer just about that simple back and forth swing.
We're now talking about those unpredictable collisions, those unexpected outcomes,
The chaos.
the chaos.
Yeah.
And that's what nonlinear change often feels like.
So imagine you're not just lifting one ball in the cradle.
Right.
You're lifting multiple balls at once.
Or what if you tilted the frame?
Right. Or even introduced a ball made of a different material like rubber instead of steel.
Now you're talking. The predictable rhythm is gone.
Totally. You get those weird angles, the energy disperses in all these different directions. It's a mess.
It is. But it's a much more accurate reflection of what many organizations are facing today.
Right. A world where the rules are constantly changing and the old playbooks just don't seem to work anymore.
Exactly. And Dr. Butterfield uses a perfect example to illustrate this.
Okay, I'm ready.
Imagine a global retail chain that's built its entire business model around physical stores,
Okay.
traditional supply chains, a customer base that's used to shopping in person.
Right. The way it's always been.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then along comes e-commerce,
Oh.
and suddenly the ground starts shifting beneath them.
Yeah, their whole frame is starting to wobble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's no longer just one ball being lifted.
No.
It's like multiple balls are being launched at them simultaneously.
So it's the rise of digital technologies.
Right.
Changing consumer preferences.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even global events that disrupt supply chains and shopping habits.
All of these forces colliding at once.
And they're all interconnected, right?
Absolutely.
Mm.
They're feeding off of each other, creating this incredibly complex and dynamic environment.
So it's not like they can just open an online store and call it a day.
No. It's like trying to put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
It's just not going to cut it.
Exactly. Because the disruption is happening at a much deeper level.
They need to rethink their entire system.
Their whole cradle.
Exactly. And this is where those feedback loops that Dr. Butterfield talks about become so crucial.
Ah, yes. Those can be real game changers.
Right, because in a nonlinear environment, even small actions can have huge unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
Ah.
For example, let's say this retail chain launches a basic e-commerce platform, but it's riddled with technical issues.
Okay.
And the customer service is terrible.
Oof. Recipe for disaster.
Right, because now you've got negative online reviews, social media complaints spreading like wildfire.
It's a downward spiral.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And it can erode trust and damage the brand's reputation really quickly.
And on the flip side, a positive feedback loop can create opportunities but also challenges.
Definitely. So Imagine they release a new product online, and it unexpectedly goes viral.
Okay.
They're suddenly flooded with orders, but their supply chain isn't equipped to handle the surge in demand.
Oh, so it's a good problem to have that's still a problem.
Exactly.
It-
And this is why agility is so crucial in a nonlinear environment.
Okay, so it's like being able to adjust your course in real time.
Yes, and being comfortable with experimentation.
So instead of trying to plan everything out in advance,
Right.
you're constantly testing new approaches, gathering feedback, and adapting as you go.
That's it. It's about embracing those rubber balls in the cradle.
I like that.
Right. Instead of just sticking with the rigid steel ones.
So in the retail example, this could mean trying out different online service offerings,
Mm-hmm.
partnering with new logistics providers to make their supply chain more flexible,
Exactly.
really using data to understand those rapidly changing consumer behaviors.
It's about constantly learning and evolving.
And what about the people within the organization?
That's a huge piece of the puzzle.
Right, because they're the ones who have to actually implement these changes.
And they're the ones who are most affected by them.
Exactly. So how do you help them navigate this kind of unpredictable environment?
Well, Dr. Butterfield talks about the importance of finding that balance between preserving what's working and dismantling what's not.
Okay, so holding on to the strengths while letting go of the things that are holding you back?
Exactly.
Oh.
So for the retail chain, it might mean retaining their strong brand identity and customer loyalty
Okay.
while completely rethinking their distribution network or even their whole approach to customer engagement.
So it's not just about tweaking the existing system
Sometimes you need to be willing to let go of the old cradle entirely.
and build a new one.
Exactly. And that can be a scary proposition.
Absolutely. But it's also where the real innovation happens.
It is. It's about embracing the unknown
Mm.
and the potential that lies within it.
Okay, so if we're facing this kind of nonlinear change, what are the most important things to remember?
Well, first, accept that you can't control everything. You have to be comfortable with a certain degree of uncertainty.
Okay. Let go of the illusion of control.
Exactly. Second, don't be afraid to experiment and to fail sometimes.
Because failure is just another form of feedback, right?
Exactly. It's an opportunity to learn and adjust.
Okay, and third,
Build resilience into your organization.
okay, what does that mean practically?
It means creating a culture where people feel safe, speaking up, sharing ideas, even if they're not sure if they'll work.
So a culture of psychological safety.
Yes, and a culture that celebrates learning and adaptation rather than punishing mistakes.
So instead of trying to avoid failure at all costs.
You're actually embracing it as a necessary part of the process.
Exactly. And when you do that, you create an environment where people can thrive even in the midst of chaos.
That's powerful. And it really highlights the limitations of those traditional change management models that Dr. Butterfield critiques.
Yes, because those models were designed for a different era.
A more linear, predictable world.
Exactly. They're based on the assumption that you can plan out every step of the change process in advance.
And that you can control all the variables.
Right. But in a nonlinear environment, that's just not realistic.
So what does Dr. Butterfield propose instead?
He talks about a new generation of change management models.
Okay, tell me more.
These models are all about agility, iteration, systems thinking.
Okay, break that down for me.
So agility means being able to move quickly and adapt to changing circumstances.
Okay, so like a speedboat instead of a giant cargo ship.
Exactly. And iteration means constantly testing new ideas, gathering feedback, and refining your approach.
So it's a continuous loop of learning and improvement. Precisely.
Yeah.
And systems thinking is about understanding how all the different parts of the organization are interconnected.
Okay, so it's not just about fixing one problem in isolation.
Right, you have to consider the ripple effects.
The unintended consequences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And these new models also emphasize things like effectuation planning and feedback sensitivity.
Okay, I'm not familiar with those terms.
So effectuation planning is about being prepared for multiple possible futures instead of just one predicted outcome.
Okay, so it's like having a plan A, B, and C.
Exactly. And being ready to pivot as needed.
And feedback sensitivity.
That's all about having systems in place to constantly monitor those feedback loops we talked about.
Right, both the positive and the negative.
And being able to respond quickly and effectively.
So it's about using those feedback loops to your advantage.
Precisely. And finally, Dr. Butterfield emphasizes the importance of cultural change.
Okay.
Because you can have the best change management models in the world,
Right.
but if your organizational culture isn't aligned with those principles...
It's not going to work.
Exactly. You need to create a culture that embraces innovation, resilience, collaboration, and psychological safety.
And that's where true transformation happens.
It is. So we've come a long way from that simple image of the Newton's cradle.
We have, but I think it's such a powerful metaphor for understanding the different types of change that we face.
I agree. And it really helps us see why those traditional change management models often fall short in today's complex world.
And what we can do differently.
Exactly. So the next time you're facing a big change at work or even in your personal life,
Mm-hmm.
take a moment to picture that Newton's cradle. Ask yourself, is this more like a single ball swinging predictably, or is it more like a chaotic collision of forces?
That's a great question. And it can help you decide how to approach the situation.
Exactly. Because you wouldn't use the same strategy for both scenarios.
Right, you need the right tools for the job.
And by understanding the dynamics of change, you can move from feeling like a victim of circumstance.
To becoming a more confident and effective change agent.
Absolutely. So I encourage you to dive deeper into Dr. Butterfield's work
Yeah, there's so much more to explore.
and to really think about how these concepts apply to your own experiences with change.
Because the world is only going to get more complex and unpredictable.
That's for sure.
So the more we can understand about how change works
The better equipped we'll be to navigate it.
and to use it to our advantage.
Exactly. So until next time, keep those cradles swinging.
And keep embracing the chaos.
I like it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the forces shaping our world.
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, until then, take care.
You too.